Welcome to part 2 of our bloody tour of the York Walls. I'm Mad Alice, your guide, here to tell you all the grisly, gory details, and hopefully you've joined us already on our journey from Micklegate Bar right the way around to Exhibition Square. We begin this episode at Bootham Bar. Now, there's always been a gateway on this site ever since the Romans first came here in the very 1st century. But the archway here actually dates from the 11th century, whereas the top of the bar dates from the 14th century. At the very top you can see 3 figurines. On the left is a stonemason. In the middle is a former Lord Mayor of the city from the 14th century, and on the right is a medieval knight holding a shield. This is one of the gateways where you can actually see the city's very own coat of arms, the St. George's Cross with lions depicted on the front. That means that this is our city. But this road follows the Via Principalis. It would have led up to the main Principia building of Roman York, the headquarters building which is situated underneath York Minster. Before we head up onto the walls, there's something else I'd like to show you. Something which many people just seemingly pass by. It's one of our famous pubs just inside the walls, and it's special for a reason. So just inside of Bootham Bar, you step into the vicinity of what is the Minster precinct. This area was actually once known as the Liberty of St. Peter. St. Peter actually being the true name of York Minster, but I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. We did used to boast at one point we had over 365 ale houses. That's why I live here. Unfortunately, we have lost a few over the years, but we have got a good 240 to keep you going. So if you time it right on a weekend, you might be able to achieve it. One of the more interesting pubs is just behind me, the Hole in the Wall. See, back in the day, the Minster had its own court, its own prison, and even its own set of gallows. And here was actually where the prison was based. The hole in the wall refers to the hole where the prisoners would actually beg for food, scraps, coins, anything that any passerby would give them. Before we head up onto the walls, take a moment to step inside of Bootham Bar. You'll see one of the features that all the gateways have of the city, and this is of course the portcullis, the gateway that would come down and block this path so that no one's coming in and no one's going out. Fortunately for us, this one is still stuck in place, but we can actually get a closer look by going inside up top. Come with me. In 1319, the city came under attack from the Scots. You see, they came here because they knew that Queen Isabella, wife of King Edward II, was staying in the city. They made plans to try and kidnap her and hold her for ransom. But the plans were foiled. They reached Bootham Bar, set fire to it, and then vanished to Myton on Swale. It was the cleric and the Archbishop and the Lord Mayor of the city that decided they would chase after them. So they gathered together a militia army made up of citizens, farmers, clergymen, 10,000 men strong, and they went out to meet them on Myton on Swale. Well, it was known as the White Battle because of the inexperience of the clergyman at war. The Scots knew exactly what they were doing. The men, desperate to escape, jumped into the river, and it said that over 1,000 of them drowned, just merely trying to escape. Eventually, they would suffer a loss of another 3,000 men. The militia was defeated and came back to York rather forlorn. Now, this stretch of wall actually follows the original Roman fortress walls, and in my opinion, it's one of the nicest stretches between Monk Bar and Bootham Bar, where we've just come from. This stretch of wall is the more romantic side of the walls. And most of the corner towers that you see here are actually renovated and recreated by the Victorians. They certainly put in these walkways. The guards back in the day wouldn't have been able to run along these stone walkways. They would have been very skinny, very delicate wooden planks. But here you see York Minster in all its splendour. There's been a church on that site since 627 AD. The minster that you see today was started in 1220 and completed in 1472. It took 252 years to complete, although you still could argue still not finished because the original designs actually had a spire on top of the central tower. In my view, this is the nicest stretch of the city walls. You can see the red brick building here and the beautiful gardens that surround it. That belongs to the Dean and Chapter of York Minster. So that's where you get to live if you are the Dean. But I want to draw your attention to the grey brick building with the scaffolding just on the end. That is actually the Minster Library, which you can visit. It's in the Dean's Park Gardens, which are open to the public, and they're a nice place to spend a sunny afternoon. What's notable about one of the collections in the Minster Library is what they call the Wicked Bible. It was published in 1631, and it contains a very grave grammatical error. When it lists the 10 Commandments, instead of reading, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," it states, "Thou shalt commit adultery." As you can imagine, King James I was not pleased with this and ended up fining the publishing company and revoked their printing licence. I say it's in the Minster Library, but I did take that copy for myself. I just thought it would be a nice keepsake for me to have. Shall we continue? The north corner of the city walls on top of Robin Hood's Tower, which is a Victorian recreation based on a tower that was here originally, also called Robin Hood's Tower. But why Robin Hood? He didn't actually have that much to do with the city. No one really knows why it's called that. The closest we can fathom was that there was actually a Robert Hood that did live here in the city in the 1220s, and he's been put on record for actually owing money to the Minster. So maybe it's him. He was known as an outlaw, but certainly not the heroic figure we normally think of Robin Hood. It's also mentioned in the ballads of Robin Hood that actually his sworn enemy was the abbot of St. Mary's Abbey. But really, there's no logical reason for that. Now, usually in the winter you can get some marvellous views of York Minster, but as you can see, spring is in full bloom, but you can definitely tell that the Minster is there with the tolling of the bells. But again, let's continue our journey and have a look into some people's backyards. Minster, the heart of the city. The largest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe, bigger than Notre Dame. Anything to beat the French, we're happy with. But during its tumultuous history, it's actually suffered 3 major fires. The first one being in 1829. The fire was discovered in the early hours of the morning. The fire had consumed the entire choir right in the centre of the church. Well, when the fire was eventually put out, the authorities started to wonder why the fire had started in the first place. They were very sure that it was actually a deliberate act of arson. They discovered that all the prayer books had pages missing, all the prayer cushions had gone. They could only assume that they had been used to make the fire. And then it dawned on them that suddenly mysterious notes had started to appear on the railings of York Minster just a few days prior. Notes saying that you must change your ways or suffer the wrath of God. An ill fate will befall your church. Signed, Jonathan Martin, and he even left a forwarding address, which actually just happened to be round the back of York Minster. So they decided they'd have a knock on Mr. Martin's door and see what he had to say for himself. Lo and behold, they'd already discovered that he'd actually fled from the city. They managed to catch up with him up in Northumberland, and eventually he actually confessed to the crimes, stating that the night of the fire he was at a service and had heard a mysterious buzzing coming from the organ. Naturally, he interpreted this buzzing as being the voice of God telling him to burn down the church. Despite confessing openly, he was put on trial and was found not guilty by way of insanity. He was made to spend the remainder of his days at the lunatic asylum in Bedlam. There he died 9 years later. So repair work had already started on the Minster, and in 1840 another fire erupted, this time on the West Towers. And this was purely accidental. As a workman was there one night, he'd actually left a candle to burn on the wooden scaffold. Of course, naturally, the entire building went up in flame, or the entire tower, I should say. But they weren't the worst of the fires. The worst one happened in more recent memory, and the citizens of York still remember it. And this is why we sympathise with Notre Dame, with the fire that happened not that long ago there. This fire happened in July 1984. The entire south transept of York Minster was completely destroyed. The beloved rose window was up in flames, and firefighters were worried that if the fire had spread towards the central tower, that would essentially act as a chimney and destroy the church even more. So the chief fire warden decided what they would do in order to put the fire out was that they would actually aim their hoses towards the wooden buttresses, thereby bringing the ceiling down, collapsing the fire, and they'd put it out from the ground. And that's exactly what they managed to achieve. But not until after the damage had been done, and the entire roof of the south transept was gone forever. Again, eyes turned to what could have started the fire, and actually that portion of the roof is where you walk along to climb up the central tower of York Minster. It's 277 steps. At first they thought maybe it was a discarded cigarette that maybe caught some leaves on the top of the roof, but then the weather reports came in. That particular evening, when the fire started, there was a single bolt of lightning that came down from the heavens and struck the south transept roof. People describe this as being the hand of God, divine wrath itself. You see, just a few days prior to the fire in York Minster in July 1984, the new Archbishop of Durham had been inaugurated in a special ceremony. He was quite an controversial archbishop, to say the least. Didn't believe in the resurrection of Christ, didn't believe in the virgin birth. Sort of two fundamentals of the Christian faith. But still the ceremony went ahead. 2 days later, the church burnt down. Locals believed that God was not happy with the choice that they'd made. Touch wood, we've been alright for fires now. But it just goes to show, maybe he is listening at times. The sandstone building that you see ahead of us with the red roof, that there is the Treasurer's house. It's nowadays owned by the National Trust, but once upon a time it was in fact the house for the Treasurer of York Minster, hence the name. It wasn't the house that you see today, but it was certainly a large grand mansion house incorporating all this area and stretched right back towards the city walls here. But it's gone through a lot of changes over the years. The house was rebuilt in the turn of the 16th and 17th century. It was owned by the Young family, Archbishop Young. And eventually the property was divided into 3 separate sections until in 1897 it was taken over by a man called Frank Green, an industrialist who decided that he would give the house over to the National Trust in 1930. It's got a very interesting history, beautifully decorated inside with different period rooms. But the most famous feature of the Treasurer's house is possibly the former occupants. You see, they haven't really left. The Treasurer's house is regarded to be one of the most haunted buildings in York. And it's said within its 14 rooms, it's said to house around about 35 ghosts, the most famous of which resides down in the cellar. You see, back in 1953, a young man called Harry Martindale was working in the cellar by himself, and he was hammering a hole in the wall when he suddenly heard in the distance the sound of a single note from a trumpet horn. Bit odd, but thinking it was something happening outside, he didn't pay too much attention, so carried on with his work. But he realised that the sound was growing louder and louder and appeared to be coming from behind the solid wall he was working up against. So as he looked down from his ladder to work out where the noise was coming from, he was surprised to see that from out of the wall in front of him stepped the figure of a Roman soldier. Naturally in a state of shock and panic, Harry fell off his ladder and scrambled into the corner of the room. As this figure emerged from the wall and gradually but steadily walked from one side of the room to the other, disappeared through the opposite wall. No sooner had this soldier disappeared when a great big black cart horse emerged from the wall, and on top of the horse another Roman soldier. The horse followed exactly the same path, disappeared. But then after this, more soldiers began to emerge from the wall, walking side by side in pairs, and Harry counted about 20 of them altogether. The first thing that struck Harry was the fact that these figures looked like real people, meaning they were solid figures, so they weren't see-through how you think ghosts to be, but he could make out all the details of the uniforms, complete with their bronze weather-beaten helmets with undyed plumes. They were dressed in green tunics accompanied by skirts made from strips of brown leather wrapped all the way around the waist. And as for the weapons, they were carrying short swords on their right side, and in their left they were carrying rounded shields. But when it came to their feet, Harry noticed something quite peculiar. They were only visible from the knees upwards. So as they walked into the room, it looked like they were walking on their knees. And it wasn't until they actually stood in a trench that had been dug out in the centre of the room that's when their feet became visible. And he could even make out the straps of the sandals laced all the way up to the knee. When he was certain that the last of these soldiers had disappeared through the wall, the sound of the trumpet horn had died down, Harry quickly picked himself up and legged it out of the cellar. He ran straight into the curator of the building, who took one look at Harry, and before Harry could tell him anything about what he'd just seen, the curator turned to him and said, "Oh dear, from the look of you, You've just seen our Roman soldiers downstairs, haven't you? Now, the thing that makes Harry's story so famous is because Harry wasn't the first person to encounter these soldiers, nor was he the last. But he has become the most famous. And the reason being is because what have they discovered in 1969? You see, excavations began underneath the central tower of York Minster, and they were surprised to find the remains of the Roman headquarters building known as the Principia, and you can go and visit it to this day if you go down into the Undercroft. But alongside these findings, they also discovered one of the major Roman roads of the city. This is a road that starts from the headquarters building, runs underneath the treasurer's house and out to the gate, which would have been situated here, around about this area. They found this Roman road buried 18 inches below the cellar floor surface. So if you think of the depth of 18 inches, which is roughly the same length from your knee down to your foot, this would explain why Harry couldn't see their feet, because they were walking along their original road. And you can actually see the remnants of where the road would have been if you follow this pathway here from the house and directly to the ramparts. You can see on the other side here there's actually a dip in the ramparts, and that is to show where the previous Roman gateway would have stood. So there you go. If you do go visit the treasurer's house, you do get a little bit more than you bargained for with your entrance ticket, so just bear that in mind. But we're not too far from the end of our part 2. Monk Bar is just ahead of us, and I'm going to tell you about the little figurine statues up top. Well, we've made it. We're at Monk Bar. This is the end of our part 2. But from here, you can make your way through that gateway and into the Richard III experience, which is all dedicated to the life of King Richard III, who was a very beloved monarch here in York. In there, you can actually decide for yourselves whether or not he was guilty for the murder of his nephews in the Tower. My personal opinion is, I don't think he did it. He had far too much to lose. But this is the complete opposite of Micklegate Bar, in terms of, in that place you can learn about Henry VII. In this one, you can learn about the king he actually slayed in battle, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Richard III was the last king to die in battle. But from this angle, you get a very good vantage point and some remarkable figures just up top of the turret. These are known as the Wild Men of York, and what they are, they're grotesque figures carrying huge boulders. They were meant as a threat to anyone who was coming into the city with bad intentions. Now, this gateway actually faces the northeast. So who do you think this is aimed at? The Scots. We used to have a bylaw in force in York that states that any person who was born within the city walls, which I was, is allowed to shoot at a Scotsman or woman, we don't discriminate, who is within sight of the city walls using a bow and arrow, but only Monday to Saturday. You weren't allowed to shoot people on a Sunday. Now, it's only just recently that that law has actually been revoked. 2012, to be honest, was when that became illegal. So my bow and arrow has been firmly put away, you might be relieved to hear. But they are little interesting characters. Slightly ironic they're here to defend the city. They didn't help when the Scots attacked Bootham Bar, but there we go. Maybe they were asleep for that one. The figurines that you see here are actually Victorian replicas. No one knows what happened to the original. I suspect they're disguised as a gnome or such in someone's garden. But for now, we're going to make our way down onto the street of Monkgate. Come with me. little adventure from Bootham Bar round to Monk Bar. Join me on the next episode where I'll be telling you all about the gruesome and grisly secrets that Monk Bar has to offer. And we'll be continuing our journey from Monk Bar round to Warmgate Bar. See you on the next adventure.